13 September 1940, Buckingham Palace. Queen Elizabeth is with George VI in her sitting room when they hear what she will describe that same afternoon in a letter to Queen Mary, the unmistakable whirr-whirr of a German plane. Then, the scream of a bomb. Bombs struck the palace, exploding in the inner quadrangle and hitting the royal chapel and forecourt. The royal chapel was destroyed. 3 workmen were injured. The king and queen weren't. Hours later, after lunching in their air raid shelter, they drove to the East End of London. Elizabeth's letter to Queen Mary records what she saw there. I felt as if I was walking in a dead city, all the houses evacuated, and yet through the broken windows one saw all the poor little possessions, photographs, beds, just as they were left. What she reportedly said to a policeman during that visit has been repeated ever since, in at least 4 distinct forms. The National WWII Museum records, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the eye." Oxford Reference gives, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Other sources render it as, "Now at last I can look the East End in the face." The wording nobody quite agrees on, because the remark was private, not broadcast, and what became a mythologized quotation started as a personal reflection that was passed along, rephrased and polished over 6 decades. The drifting of that phrase is worth noting. Not because the remark wasn't genuine. The letter itself, reproduced in William Shawcross's 2009 authorized biography, makes clear she was deeply moved by what she witnessed. But because the way a private remark becomes a national symbol tells you something precise about how an image gets built. Through repetition, through everyone agreeing to tell it the same way, and through nobody being particularly interested in the version that got left out. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes Lyon was born on 4 August 1900, 9th of 10 children of Claude Bowes Lyon, 14th Earl of Strathmore. She married Prince Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey in April 1923. She became Queen Consort, not a reigning monarch, never a monarch in her own right, on 11 December 1936, when the abdication crisis placed her husband on the throne as George VI. She became Queen Mother on 6 February 1952, when George VI died at Sandringham, and held that title until her death on 30 March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101. Her death certificate gave the cause as extreme old age. She had been the Queen Mother for 50 years. When she was laid in state at Westminster Hall that April, an estimated 200,000 people filed past her coffin over 3 days. Queues stretched roughly a mile along the Thames. Wait times reached 12 hours. More than 2,000 mourners attended the funeral at Westminster Abbey on 9 April, and the Abbey's tenor bell tolled 101 times. The New York Times ran its obituary under the headline, "Britain's beloved Queen Mum, a symbol of courage, dies at 101. CBS News called her the beloved matriarch. The BBC Select write-up describes her as a much-loved public figure. History Hit used identical phrasing. A 2015 documentary called her one of the most beloved figures in royal history. That word appears across every genre, every platform, every decade. By 2002, beloved had become less a description than a grammatical fixture, the word that automatically followed her name. The question nobody seemed to ask was whether it had ever been tested. A few years ago, a channel called Factinate posted a video titled, "The Queen Mother Has a Darker Legacy Than People Know." In the comments beneath that video, something happened that hadn't really been possible before the internet existed. 3 separate viewers, with no connection to each other, directly contradicted the premise that every major flattering documentary about this woman opens with. One, reportedly writing as an 82-year-old woman, said she had never understood why people called the Queen Mother beloved. That as far back as she could remember, even when very young, the adults around her had not liked her, and that this had stayed with her all her life. Another reported that her grandmother had always maintained the Queen Mother wasn't a nice person. A third wrote simply that a lot of people didn't like her. Those are comments on a video platform, not depositions. They're testimony, not documentation. A video with "Darker Legacy" in its title will attract viewers who already have doubts. You can't treat its comments section as a representative sample of the population. But here is what makes them worth examining. These are old enough viewers to remember the era they're describing from the inside. They're not summarizing a biography. They're reporting private opinion from homes and conversations that never made it into print. And the question they raise: was the beloved consensus ever actually as universal as the documentaries claimed? Turns out to have a documented answer. The answer is not even close to it. The polling shows genuine majority affection alongside a persistent minority dissent that simply never found its way into the public record. And the reason it didn't has everything to do with how the British media operated for the majority of her public life. Start with what the myth was actually built from. The wartime narrative is the structural foundation. The account runs: the palace was bombed, the royal family refused to evacuate, the king and queen walked through the rubble alongside ordinary Londoners, and by doing so, they earned genuine national affection that lasted the remainder of her very long life. Most of that is broadly accurate. What the standard version omits is the detail that complicates it. During her early visits to bombed working-class districts, Elizabeth's presence provoked hostility. Crowds jeered, rubbish was thrown. Contemporary accounts link part of this to her clothing. She arrived in pastel dresses, pearls, and hats during a civilian emergency. Her explanation was that people coming to see her would put on their best clothes, so she should do the same. Her designer, Norman Hartnell, described his wartime color palette as representing the rainbow of hope. Fashion critics of the period were less generous. One post-war summary described her wartime style as once the despair of fashion critics. The East End jeering is in the contemporaneous record. Later documentaries simply removed it and kept the rainbow. The refuse to leave London story also requires precision. What is confirmed and historically significant is the refusal to evacuate abroad. The declaration that, "The children won't leave without me, I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave the country in any circumstances." That stance was genuine and consequential. It didn't mean the family remained continuously at Buckingham Palace throughout the Blitz. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret spent much of the war at Windsor Castle, 20 miles outside London and considered considerably safer. The palace was hit 9 times during the war. The symbolic declaration, "We are staying," was real. The mythology simply grew beyond it. The image building continued for 50 years after the war ended. By her centenary in August 2000, approximately 40,000 people had gathered along the Mall for her birthday. She served as patron or president of approximately 350 organizations. She was consistently visible, consistently gracious, consistently photographed in pastels. The brand was remarkably stable. So stable, in fact, that even the Factinate article that would generate those comments opens from it. Before Princess Diana, no one was as beloved in the royal family as Elizabeth, the Queen Mum. The challenge to the premise appears in the comments beneath. The article itself launches from the very consensus it's ostensibly questioning. That's not hypocrisy, it's genre. The beloved framing had become so automatic that even revisionist content couldn't start anywhere else. The counter record is real, documented, and largely absent from the celebratory genre. It falls into 3 categories: appeasement, racism, and the gap between private and public character. On appeasement. In September 1938, Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich and appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony alongside George VI and Elizabeth. Historians describe this as constitutionally improper, the royal family visibly endorsing a specific political act. The photographs exist. Elizabeth's private views at the time are harder to document cleanly, but historian Andrew Roberts, in his biography of Lord Halifax, reports that in November 1939, 2 months into the war, Elizabeth sent Halifax a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf, accompanied by a letter referring to Hitler's obvious sincerity. Historian Karina Urbach, speaking to the BBC, states Elizabeth gave Hitler the benefit of the doubt before the war. Shawcross's authorized biography, drawn from the full Royal Archive, found no evidence of sympathy for Nazism in the wartime correspondence and records her describing brutal Nazi ideology during the conflict itself. His account of her retrospective on Munich is that it gave us 1 year to rearm. These readings aren't entirely incompatible. She appears to have shared the common pre-war misjudgments of her class and era, abandoned them when war arrived, and contributed genuinely to the Allied cause. The authorized biography presents the most forgiving version. The Munich balcony and the Halifax letter present a less flattering one. The flattering documentary genre presents neither. On racism, the sourcing requires care because the quality varies considerably. The strongest documented instance comes from Sir Roy Strong, former director of both the National Portrait Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Strong is a named, credible witness. He reported publicly that at a lunch at Ham House, while the Queen was on tour in Africa, the Queen Mother said, "Beware the blackamoors." Strong stated he omitted this from his published diaries at the time because it was too awful. He described her as color-prejudiced. Journalist Tanya Gold, writing in The Guardian in September 2009, drew on a lady-in-waiting's recollection to quote her saying of Africans, "Poor darlings, the Africans just don't know how to govern themselves. What a pity we're not still looking after them." The published diaries of Woodrow Wyatt, a political associate of hers, record some reservations about Jews. Counter-testimony exists. Robert Rhodes James, an early biographer, reported she privately abhorred racial discrimination and called apartheid dreadful. Major Colin Burgess, whose wife was mixed race, denied the slur allegations. The authorized biography found no corresponding material in the official letters. The most extreme allegations, specific slurs, active support for apartheid regimes, come primarily from hostile political commentary rather than named witnesses in mainstream outlets. The strongest evidence, the Roy Strong account and the Gold column, comes from credible sources. The flattering documentaries don't engage with either tier. That selective absence is itself meaningful. The pattern holds. Documented complexity exists, available in published biographies and broadsheet journalism. The mainstream documentary genre doesn't pick it up, not because of a coordinated suppression, but because the format selects for a different story. When that selection holds for 60 years, the impression it creates begins to function as historical fact. Now the polling. This is where the argument moves from anecdote to evidence. There is no Gallup or NOP time series specifically tracking the Queen Mother's individual approval from 1950 to 1990. Pollsters in that era tracked the monarchy, or the Queen, meaning Elizabeth II, rather than the Queen Mother as a distinct subject. That absence is itself a signal. She was considered broadly uncontroversial enough that nobody thought to measure her separately. The data we have covers two things. First, Republican sentiment as an institutional proxy. Between 1953 and 1976, support for abolishing the monarchy ranged between 9 and 19% across polling by Gallup, NOP, and mass observation. Mass observation measured it at 16% in 1964. NOP, in October 1969, found that 16% of Britons thought Britain didn't need the Queen at all. Among adults under 34, the figure was notably higher. These numbers were consistent across 20 years. They never represented a majority. They also never went away. The Queen Mother was, for most of that period, the symbolic heart of what the monarchy represented, the living connection to the Blitz generation, the wartime steadiness. To be skeptical about the institution in those decades was partly to be skeptical about what she embodied. On the Queen Mother specifically, the data from the 1980s and 1990s is more precise. Maury and Gallup ran periodic polls asking Britons to name their favorite members of the royal family. Around 1988, a Gallup poll reported by the Daily Telegraph found 19% named her as their favorite royal, fractionally more than named Elizabeth II, at 11%. By 1998, approximately 29% included her among their 2 or 3 favorites. By 2001, that figure had fallen to around 20%. The peak of 29% deserves attention. At her most popular in available polling data, when Britons were asked to name their favorite royals, roughly 3/4 didn't choose her. These are favorite questions. They don't ask who you actively dislike. Even so, named by under a third as among their favorites isn't a measurement of universal belovedness. It's a precise measurement of genuine but minority to plurality affection. The single sharpest contemporaneous measure of divided opinion comes from August 2000. When the BBC decided not to broadcast her 100th birthday parade live, Maury surveyed public opinion on the decision. 56% thought the BBC was wrong. 34% thought the BBC was right. More than a third of the British public actively didn't believe her centenary deserved live television. That is a clean, numerically specific, contemporaneous split. Not a flaw in the available data, but the point of it. The Mass Observation Archive adds a qualitative layer. Mass Observation was founded in 1937 and has collected diary responses and directive answers from panelists across the entire post-war period. Their summer 2000 directive specifically listed Queen Mother at 100 as one of its questions, meaning the archive at the University of Sussex contains written responses capturing private attitudes toward her centenary, including ambivalent and critical ones that would never have appeared in a tabloid. Purcell and Courage, in their 2024 academic book on mass observation and the monarchy, note that MO material consistently shows diversity and ambivalence in attitudes toward royal events, admiration and identification, but also indifference, hostility, and Republican sentiment, even when media coverage suggests national unity. That phrase is worth holding. The private record contradicted the public consensus, repeatedly, across the entire period. National unity in the newspapers, ambivalence and dissent in the diaries. In the mainstream press, criticism existed during her lifetime in forms the obituaries chose not to mention. The Independent ran a profile in 1999, while she was alive and still a public figure, under the headline, "The Queen Mother, Bigoted, Snobbish, Profligate." Socialist Worker ran its 2000 centenary piece as "Snob, Racist, and Bigot, and we are paying to keep her in luxury." A Guardian column from May 2000, commenting on the BBC birthday coverage decision, argued that while the Queen Mother was widely respected as a splendid old trooper, few under 40 shared the intense emotional attachment the tabloids were projecting. These publications sit at opposite ends of the political spectrum. The critical view of her wasn't confined to one faction. The picture the polling and press record produces isn't of uniform adoration or of uniform contempt. It's of genuine majority affection coexisting with a documented minority dissent that was consistently available in the primary record and consistently absent from the documentary genre. The structural explanation for that absence sits in the history of how the British press related to the palace. The defining case study predates her time as Queen Mother, the 1936 abdication crisis. Edward VIII's relationship with Wallis Simpson was being covered extensively by American and European newspapers throughout that year. In Britain, newspaper proprietors, personally approached by palace figures including Lord Beaverbrook, entered what contemporaneous commentary called a gentleman's agreement not to publish. The domestic blackout held for months. A Chicago Tribune correspondent described it as an excellent example of how, without official censorship, voluntary censorship is imposed by the newspapers on themselves. The Guardian's own digital archive holds a piece specifically titled 1936, British Press Finally Breaks Silence on Wallace Simpson, recording the moment the blackout collapsed. Edward Owens, in The Family Firm, his 2019 academic work published by the University of London Press, presents the first major historical analysis of how Buckingham Palace worked systematically with the Church of England and Fleet Street between 1932 and 1953 to project a specific royal image. Beginning with George V's Christmas broadcasts, the palace shaped what information entered the public record and treated the BBC with what Owens describes as disdain when coverage deviated from it. The institution felt little need to provide information that didn't support the image they wished to convey. The journalists working in that system understood the rules. Godfrey Talbot, a veteran BBC court correspondent, recalled in a 1985 interview that in the post-war era, there was never anything provocative written. It wasn't considered right about the royal family. Max Hastings, the former Daily Telegraph editor, described how broadsheet newspapers felt a responsibility to try to protect the royal family from the assaults of the media, and identified Rupert Murdoch as at the forefront of the process of killing deference. Roy Greenslade described the post-war period as an age of deference, in which royals were practically immovable, inviolable. The PBS Frontline Archive on British press culture notes that Fleet Street, in the run-up to the 1953 coronation, operated under a consensus that disloyal stories about the royal family were simply dynamite. Newspaper owners seeking establishment respectability enforced their own silence. Private Eye, founded in October 1961, was the primary countervoice. Its royal mockery was culturally significant for the audience it reached, but it was numerically marginal relative to the national press. The outlet for dissent existed. It simply had no mass platform. The cultural shift happened earlier than the standard Diana narrative implies. The National Library of Scotland's History of the Royal Family in the 1980s notes they became the nation's favorite soap opera, with tabloid exposure intensifying and public respect certainly diminished by the end of the decade. Spitting Image, running from 1984 to 1996, depicted the Queen Mother as a horse-racing-obsessed alcoholic. Grotesque mockery on primetime mainstream television. But by the time that culture arrived, the Queen Mother's image had been in formation for nearly 50 years. The critical tabloid exposure that damaged Charles's reputation in the 1980s barely touched hers. Her mythology had been built in conditions of structural deference, and those conditions had held long enough to feel like settled fact. For most of her active public life, roughly 1936 through 1985, the formal British press operated under an assumption that certain things weren't written. Critical views existed. They circulated in diaries, in mass observation responses, in letters to editors that went unsent. They didn't become part of the visible record. The consensus that she was universally beloved was less a reflection of what everyone actually thought, and more a story told so consistently in every major outlet that it began to function as consensus by repetition. This is where the YouTube comments matter again, not as historical documentation, but as a sociological signal about what had been suppressed. When Factinate posted its Darker Legacy video, it created something that hadn't existed for most of the 20th century. A visible, searchable public space where ordinary people could register disagreement with a received consensus. An 82-year-old woman writing about her lived experience in post-war Britain had, for most of her life, no practical mechanism for that observation to reach anyone beyond her immediate circle. She wasn't going to ring the BBC. She wasn't going to write to a newspaper. The infrastructure for private dissent to cross from a kitchen table to any form of public visibility simply didn't exist. The comment section isn't a poll. It's a qualitative signal. For many older viewers, the first time a public space existed for views that had previously had nowhere to land. The self-selection problem must be acknowledged clearly. A video titled "Darker Legacy" will attract viewers who already have doubts. The comments beneath it aren't a representative sample of public opinion. They are a sample of people who sought out a dissenting narrative and found it worth responding to. That's a different thing. But notice the specificity of what reportedly appeared. Not abstract anti-royal ideology, not "the monarchy is a feudal relic." The 82-year-old commenter reportedly described a precise personal disconnect. She never understood the word "beloved" as applied to this specific woman because the adults around her, from her earliest memory, didn't use it that way. The grandmother account is similar, not politics, but memory of how people talked in private. Not a nice person is what you say when you're recalling the actual texture of adult conversation, not rehearsing an ideological position. These are the textures of private opinion that mass observation spent decades quietly collecting from panelists, material that filled the archive at Sussex and never appeared in the evening news. The conclusion isn't that she was disliked. The polling makes that untenable. The 200,000 people in the Westminster Hall queue were real. The Maury peak of 29% naming her among their favorites was real. The morning in 2002 was genuine. But at her most popular in the available polling, 3/4 of Britons didn't list her as a favorite. Republican sentiment ran at 9 to 19% for 20 unbroken years. Mass observation found private ambivalence and hostility even during events the press described as moments of national unity. The Independent called her bigoted and snobbish, while she was still alive. A third of the country didn't think her 100th birthday deserved live television. These facts, and the "beloved matriarch" headline, exist in the same historical record. The documentary genre chose one of them, consistently, for 70 years. The mechanism that maintained that choice wasn't conspiracy. It was culture. A culture of deference that made certain criticisms unprintable by convention, that elevated certain editors to establishment figures with establishment loyalties, that gave ordinary people watching the television no practical means of registering private disagreement with the caption beneath the image. That culture weakened through the 1980s and largely dissolved after 1997. But the Queen Mother's image was formed before it weakened, and it held. What changed isn't her legacy. What changed is the infrastructure of public opinion. The comment section is where the private record finally meets the public one. Fragmentary, unverified in its particulars, but carrying the texture of a history that the polished version couldn't accommodate. Maybe she was beloved by most people, most of the time, and these voices are exceptions. Or maybe beloved was never quite the consensus the documentaries needed it to be, just the version that was safest to repeat for 70 years, until the people who remembered it differently finally had somewhere to say so. Either way, the next time a documentary opens with "the nation's beloved grandmother," it's worth asking who decided that and who never got a vote.